Okay. So this is World War I art, take two, right? Unfortunately, it was inadvertently not recorded this morning, so I'm doing it all over again. And maybe a little briefer version, but this is what we did in terms of World War I art. Obviously, the World War had a tremendous impact on the culture moving forward. We looked at the poetry, literature, novels, and so on of the period, and most of it being written by veterans of the war, so they had the first-hand experience, and that colored their reminiscences of the war and the impact of the war and the horror of the war and so on. Well, this carried over into other cultural norms, into film. I'll mention a film at the end that's very interesting. I wish we'd had a chance to see it, but it also obviously affected the art that is a product of World War I. And most of the art that appears relating to and representing World War I appeared in the 1920s. And for the most part, from the palette or the brush of veterans of the war. And they were very profoundly affected, and that's reflected in the artwork that they produced that puts on canvas their recollections and their, in many cases, trauma from the experience. Now, in front of you, the first slide is a cover of a book, came out just a few years ago, of representative World War I art. It's called Nothing But the Clouds Unchanged, Artists in World War I. By the way, the picture in the background of the cover is from a painting by Wyndham Lewis, who was a British artist of World War I. And his style, you can see, is to show the destruction of the landscape as a result of the war. All of his paintings have these cratered earth and broken and misformed trees as a result of bombings, and even the figures of the soldiers, you see they're like stick-like figures, almost skeletal, and so on. And that was really his style of representation and his artwork. Now, it's called Nothing But the Clouds Unchanged. And where does the title come from? It comes from a remark by a fellow by the name of Walter Benjamin. And Walter Benjamin, very interesting story, was a philosopher, very interesting German-Jewish philosopher, and very eclectic. I mean, he combines all sorts of elements in his philosophy, Western Marxism, Jewish mysticism, German idealism, romanticism. Brilliant man, absolutely brilliant man. And he wrote a lot of treatises on different cultural changes and different elements in the modern world and so on. Very accomplished and very significant figure. Unfortunately, suffered a very tragic end, just as an aside. What happened was, he died in 1940. All right, as I said, he was a German-Jewish philosopher and writer. He obviously, the Nazis took over the government in 1933. By 1940, things were significantly worse than they were at the beginning. In the interim, there were the Nuremberg race laws that were passed in 1935, and the famous Kristallnacht, the Nazi pogrom against Jews and synagogues and businesses and everything else. Germany was 1938. And by 1940, we're moving towards the concentration camps being fully operative. So Benjamin realized he's got to get out of there. He's got to leave Germany. Not a good place to be if you're a Jew. And so he managed to get himself across the border into France. But France in 1940 wasn't a good year. In 1940, the Germans began swallowing up all of Europe. And it began in the West with the occupation of Norway, and then France, and the Low Countries, Belgium, Holland, and so on. And so the northern part of France was Nazi occupied. The southern part of France was the Vichy government, was the Nazi collaborationist government. So staying in France was not an option. And he did what many people did, including some relatives of mine who were living in Belgium and had to get out. He found his way to the border at the south of France, the border with Spain. But the Spanish-French border are the Pyrenees Mountains. Not so easy to get through. So what he did is, what most people did in that situation. They paid a guide to get them through the Pyrenees mountains. They knew the passes and how to get through and get themselves to the other side in Spain. And he managed to get to Spain, just the other side of the border, in a place called Port Boo. And there he was alone with his valises and all of his unpublished manuscripts with him and in his packages and so on. And he checked into a small guest house. Someone or other started a rumor that the German forces are now on their way to Spain, that they were imminently going to be crossing into Spain, and he panicked. Now they're going to get him in Spain, and so he committed suicide. What happened was the next morning, when the woman who owned this little guest house, this pension, didn't see him at breakfast, she wondered and went to his room and knocked on the door. There was no answer. Tried a few times, then called the local police. They knocked on the door and finally just broke the door down and realized he had killed himself. To add insult to injury, on the table in his room were all of the unpublished manuscripts that he brought with him. The woman who owned this little guest house was not exactly, probably didn't speak German to begin with, was probably not a particularly educated or sophisticated individual, had no idea who this guy was or what these manuscripts meant. And she used them for kindling in the fireplace, and they were burnt up and never saw the light of day being published. The truth is, had Benjamin not gotten out of Germany, unfortunately, he probably would have ended up going out the chimney in smoke in one of the concentration camps. But that's the story of Walter Benjamin. In any case, after World War I, to get back to this, he wrote this a description of what the world looked like after World War I. He said, a generation that still drove to school in horse-drawn carriages suddenly stood under the open sky in a landscape with nothing but the clouds unchanged. And in the center, in a force field of destructive currents and explosions, was a tiny, fragile human body. So what is he describing? Before World War I, World War I was sort of the dividing line between the modern world as we know it and what existed before. So let's say by 1914, sure, Europe had become more modernized, industrialized, but it still wasn't what we think of in terms of modernity. And many of the individuals who fought in or lived at that time still were a generation that went to school in a horse and buggy. They didn't have motorized cars or anything. So that generation drove to school in these horse-drawn carriages. And now all of a sudden, there they are. The war is over, and they're standing there in an open landscape. And the only thing that hasn't changed are the clouds above, right? And that's where he gets the title from. Why? Everything down below was destroyed by the war. It was cratered, it was destroyed, it's in ruins, it's whatever. But the fighting takes place under the clouds, right? So the only thing that remained unchanged when World War I ended were the clouds. Everything else was not as it was before and will never be the same again. And that's where the title comes from in this collection of artwork. Only the clouds remain unchanged. All right, now this first reproduction of a painting by Otto Dix is one of the most famous and identifiable pieces of World War I art. Otto Dix is one of those figures, that's something about him, one of those figures who is most associated with post-World War I and who suffered the consequences in many ways, as you'll see. But who was this guy? All right, so Otto Dix was born, in December of 1891. He died in July of 1969. He was a German painter and he was a printmaker, and he's known really for his ruthless and harshly realistic style. Realistic, not in the sense of photograph realistic in terms of driving home a very powerful message, as you can see in this painting. And he was, as I said, born in Germany, in Untermhaus. He began actually his art career as a child because he had a relative who was a painter. And he would spend time in his studio watching. So he was very much influenced by that, and I guess decided on a career in art early on. And as time went on, he studied more and more in various institutions of art. When the First World War broke out in 1914, he very enthusiastically joined the German army. As we noted earlier on in the class, there was great enthusiasm all around for the war effort. And he was one of those individuals who was gung-ho, signed up right away. One of the reasons he volunteered was he figured if he volunteers, he'll have more of a choice where he goes, as opposed to being enlisted and told where to go. And he might find himself in a better situation, not so dangerous. But as it turns out, he was one of the soldiers who took part in the first Battle of the Somme, which you remember from the beginning, one of the important battles early on in the war. And then in 1917, he was transferred to the Eastern Front. He served there for a while, but remember, 1917 was the year of the Russian Revolution and the Russians pulling out of World War I. So he was sent back to the Western Front. There was no war going on in the East anymore. He was injured. He was wounded slightly from shrapnel, and he received the Iron Cross, second class, because of his injuries. In 1918, the war ended. He returned to his hometown. Then he moved to the town of Dresden, Germany, and he studied at the Hochschule für Bildende Künste, important art school. And he went through an expressionist phase in art. Expressionism then was the main current in art. What was expressionism? Basically all of these paintings you're going to see fall into that category of expressionism. Like the name suggests, it was a movement that was very expressive, very striking and powerful. How was it characterized? Mostly by the use of primary colors, bright red, bright green, bright blue, and so on. Very in your face and very pronounced and very, powerful. So expressionism was his mode of artistic work, artistic output, and so on. He then joined a number of these modernist art movements with which he was associated for a while. Interestingly, his paintings and the paintings of George Grosz that we're going to look at, and Max Beckmann that we're going to look at, and others of that period and that time and theme, of course, when the Nazis came into power, they were banned. It was known as Entartete Kunst in German, degenerate art. First of all, because it's not, typical or traditional German art, with nice blonde-haired, blue-eyed little Mädchen and dirndl skirts and, landscapes with the snow-capped peaks of the Alps in the background and everything else. This is obviously not that kind of art. So it's not the style of traditional art, so it was banned for that. But it was also banned, more importantly, because of the subject matter. The Nazis were big on war. They were big militarists. And they were, if anything, out there to have their vengeance on the outcome of World War I. They glorified World War I because they said they were stabbed in the back, and now they were going to make good on that stab in the back by stabbing everyone else in the back, basically. And these pieces of art actually were negative responses to World War I. And they showed the horror and the brutality and the aftermath of World War I. So they were all banned. And what the Nazis did is they collected all of this art wherever they could find it, and they had little traveling art shows of degenerate art. And Dick's paintings were prominently displayed in these traveling exhibits. Very few people appreciated the value and the impact of these artists' works. It was hard to even sell these things, except for a few art dealers who were knowledgeable enough and foresighted enough to realize they're going to be worth a fortune. So some people did invest in them, and they were right. You can't touch these things. They cost millions of dollars now, and most of them are in museums anyway. A few years ago, there was actually an exhibit in a gallery. Just I happened to coincidentally walk by on Madison Avenue, and it was an exhibit of Otto Dix, a number of his paintings, and they're always examples of his work in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So he was one of these figures who came back from the war, pursued his artistic career, and the subject matter of his work to the greatest degree, to a great extent, was um, representing on canvas the brute horror and the stark ruthlessness of World War I. And this picture is one very good example. It's called in German the Skatspieler, the card players. Skat is S-K-A-T, is a particular form of card playing. I'm not exactly sure, but these are card players. So what do you see in this picture? And what is he trying to portray? All right. These three figures are veterans of World War I. Obviously, these are very grotesque embodiments because he's trying to impress on the viewer the brute horror of the war and its aftermath and the guys who survived and the shape they were in, right? So it's a very grotesque group portrait. These are three veterans of the war, right? And each one represents a different aspect of this post-war trauma. First, looking at the guy on the left. All right, now the guy on the left, all right, he's one of the participants. He's playing cards. Where exactly is he holding his cards? If you look carefully, it appears as though he's holding them in his foot because he hasn't got an arm, right? The arm is missing and the foot becomes the replacement, and that's where the cards are being held. Also, you can see that he lost his hearing and he has no ear. It was blown off. So therefore, there's this little tube-like thing that hooks up to an amplifier of some sort or a loudspeaker on the table. That's the only way you can hear, right? Because he no longer has the faculty of hearing. His face is pretty much damaged and destroyed, parts of it missing so that you see his teeth clearly. There's no cheek covering them. We also have an indication of what this guy's life was before. It's sort of, what was his status, shall we say, his social or economic status. He's relatively well dressed. That's a very nice jacket he's wearing. But if you look closely, it's not made of material because after the war, there were all these shortages and there was a need to improvise. And so that jacket is made out of some sort of reprocessed corrugated carton. We also realize that he's blind. And that's why you see the three stripes on the sleeve. They're reflectors, so that anyone driving by or seeing him, their headlights will reflect off the sleeve and realize there's someone there. How do we know that he was probably a well-heeled or at least upper class or upper middle class sort of a figure, very well-dressed and so on? If you look carefully on the sleeve of the shirt coming out of the sleeve of this jacket, there's a cuff link. He's wearing French cuffs. People normally don't wear French cuffs. It's more of a formal sort of attire, formal dress, but obviously he was a very natty dresser. And so the one sleeve has this one cufflink on it. Now, as is the case with all three of these guys, they were severely damaged during the war, and to the extent that they're missing body parts. And if you look carefully, you will note that all three of them basically are missing the bottom half of their body. The chair that they're sitting on and the legs on the chair basically are substitute for the bottom part of the body and the legs that they would have had before. In the case of the guy on the left, again, there's some stick-like or rod-like protrusion coming out of what would have been the other leg. It's a prosthesis. It's a substitute leg, right? So that's the fellow on the left. The fellow on the right, right, in blue, All right, so we know he's a war veteran. Why? Because you notice that Iron Cross on his chest. And as we noted, the painter himself, excuse me, Otto Dix received the Iron Cross second class because he was wounded in the war. And this guy clearly was wounded in the war, and he's wearing his Iron Cross. Now, he's lost the bottom part of his face, which is replaced by some sort of metal prosthesis. But if you look carefully, there's a portrait on the side, on the right side of this metal prosthesis. And it's, if you see the picture in close-up, it's a picture of him as a young soldier before he ended up like this. So these are allusions, obviously, to his pre-war status and his pre-war, wholeness of body, and now the post-war, where most of it is gone. Also, he's holding his cards. On one hand, the one closest to the viewer looks like it's totally deformed. It looks like a lobster that's holding it. Obviously, it's a totally deformed hand. And the other one, which is sort of in a strange way over the top of his head, is also rather bizarre, because the hand looks like just a skeleton. But what it is, it's a wooden prosthesis, a wooden replacement for the hand that's missing. But it's not even in a normal alignment. It's sort of slopes, over the top of his head. And the top of his head, you can see that it was seriously wounded, the back part. And he's also missing his nose. So there's this thing covering up what would have been the nose previously. Again, seriously wounded and grotesquely mangled and missing body parts. Now, the guy in the middle, interesting fellow, he too is seriously injured, a serious victim of the war. He has no arms or legs at all. So he's holding his cards in his teeth. He's also missing an eye. That's some sort of glass eye on the right side. Missing part of his face, and the teeth are just showing out. But what's interesting is the exposed brain. And if you look closely, in that exposed brain, there's an image. You have to look very carefully, but in that image, there are two people dancing. So what's that all about? That's what he has on his mind. Back in the good old days, before all of this, he was a young guy, he'd been out dancing. He would have had a normal social life. Now it's all in his mind. In this condition, he can't be part of society. And these guys that came back mangled and missing body parts and grotesquely injured and wounded, they basically had to stick to themselves because they couldn't really show themselves in normal society because they were just too frightening for people to look at. And that's why the three of them, are together in this cafe. We know it's a cafe because those newspapers behind him on the hooks are typical of a European cafe. You walk in and you order what you want, and then you can take one of the magazines or newspapers hanging there to read while you're eating or whatever. So it's a cafe. And the three of them are survivors. They're veterans, but all three share their physical and probably mental condition as a result of the war. But you know what? There's one other person. If you look at the top corner on the left, there's a lantern. And in the lantern, if you look carefully, is a skull. So what's that all about? Well, they came back, right? Albeit in a damaged form. But then there were their comrades in arms. They didn't come back at all. And that skeleton in that lantern represents the other member of their military group who didn't survive, but who's always in their mind because you never forget all of the comrades you lost that were blown apart or shot to death or whatever right there in front of you. They're a constant image and memory that you can't get rid of. It's an unending nightmare. And so that figure of the departed soldier that was once among their ranks, he's off there in the lantern in the form of a skull. It's an extremely typical, characteristic, grotesque representation of the effect of World War I, and that's Otto Dix. Another very important figure in this Weimar period of the 1920s in German art was a guy by the name of George Grosz. And interesting figure, tells something about him as well. Of course, Grosz and Dixon, all these guys, they were all familiar to each other and formed part of that sort of fraternity of vets who were artists and so on. This is the story of George Grosz. Now, George Grosz, when he was born, was known as Georg Ehrenfried Grosz, G-R-O, with the S set, the German symbol for two S's. So why is he called George Grosz without the S set? And it's not Georg, it's George. Well, he wanted to separate himself from Germany as much as he could. That experience of World War I soured him so terribly on Germany and its history and everything else. He wanted to completely separate himself from it. So he anglicized his name to George, and he spelled Grosz in using Roman characters rather than the S set of the German alphabet representing the double S. He was born in July of 1893. He died in July of 1959. He was, again, known for his post-World War I art, especially his caricatures of life in Berlin in the 1920s, of which this is one. But there are many others that show some of the underside of life, prostitutes and so on, but all of the sordid life of Berlin in the 20s. Berlin in the 20s was one of the exciting periods you can imagine, but it also had a lingering threat for the future embedded in it. And we'll talk about that because it's symbolized in this picture. So he became part of a group known as Berlin Dada, D-A-D-A. We're going to talk about Dada separately. And also what was known as the Neue Sachlichkeit, new objectivity, because after World War I, there was a new sense of objectivity. It was the need and the compulsion to show the world what they had lived through, what they had experienced, and that's shown in their paintings. Grosz grew up in Pomerania, Pommern. His mother became a keeper of local hussars, officers' mess hall. His father died when he was young. His father died in 1901. At the urging of one of his cousins, the young Grosz attended drawing lessons in a drawing class in a local, given by a local painter. But that, again, encouraged him and paved the way for his future career as an artist. In 1914, he, again, like everyone else, he volunteered for military service, hoping that by avoiding conscription, he would get a cushier assignment rather than being sent right to the front. But he was discharged early on for various health problems, at which point he changed his name. He said he changed his spelling. He was very much against German nationalism, one of the big causes of the war, and so on. And he also had this incredible romantic enthusiasm for America, which was not uncommon. It's an amazing story. Many of the, not only artists, but many of the writers in the early 20s in Europe had this fascination with the American frontier, the far west. And they read James Fenimore Cooper and all these other figures that wrote about the Wild West and so on. And he was one of them. He always had this love for America from the distance. And as I said, read James Fenimore Cooper and Bret Harte and also Karl May. Now, Karl May was actually Austrian, and Karl May never saw America either, but he was also fascinated with the Wild West, and he wrote a whole series of novels about an Indian, a Native American by the name of Winnetou, and Grosz read those as well. And he had a very good friend who was an artistic collaborator of his by the name of Helmut Herzfeld. He anglicized his name also, and he became John Hartfield, right? So there was, on the one hand, the love of America, a romantic one, because they were never there, but also a hatred of German nationalism. By the way, like many of them, Grosz ended up joining the Spartacist League, which was a communist movement in Germany after the war. He did his first paintings while he was still a student, first oils in 1912. His like I said, his style was clearly influenced by Expressionism and Futurism and so on. Then he finally emigrated to the United States in 1933. Obviously, the Nazis were out to get him too, not on religious grounds, it was Lutheran, but on artistic grounds because they didn't care for his artwork. And he spent the rest of his life here in America. Basically, he lived in Huntington, New York, on the island, and he taught painting at the Huntington Township Art League. I think he was also connected with the Art Students League on 57th Street in Manhattan. And he, he was very well known and was a lecturer, a teacher, as well as a producer of great art. His art had a tremendous influence on the whole modern art movement, on new objectivity, and so on. It's an interesting story. I think I talked about, apparently it was a lawsuit. The estate of Gross, this is after he's dead, claimed that a guy by the name of Sabarsky acquired 440 of Gross's works secretly, and ones that were produced in Germany in the 1910s and 20s. What's interesting is there's a museum on Fifth Avenue and 86th Street called the Neue Galerie. And it's a museum of German and Austrian art. It's in an old Vanderbilt mansion. It was bought and established, the museum, by a guy by the name of Ronald Lauder, L-A-U-D-E-R, Estee Lauder's son, Estee Lauder being the cosmetics queen. I've been there many times on an Lauder, and there's a cafe called the Sabarsky Cafe in the museum, obviously connected to this guy Sabarsky. I'm not sure what the connection is to Lauder, although apparently I know there is one. I just don't remember what it is, but small world, the art world. Anyway, so this is a painting by George Gross. It was done in 1926. Year's probably important. What is the title of it? Stützen der Gesellschaft, which in English means Pillars of Society. And the title is plays on the title of a drama by the Norwegian dramatist Henrik Ibsen. It's really, in a sense, an apocalyptic caricature, but it captures the Berlin of the mid-20s, of the mid-Weimar Republic after the war. And it portrays in a caricature form the different elements in Germany that are ultimately going to produce the tragedy and horror that came about in 1933 with the rise of Nazi Germany. So who are these figures? What exactly do they represent? And why is this amalgam or this composition of these different types so frightening? Well, let's start in the front. The very first guy, sort of looking off to the left, not a pleasant looking guy, to put it mildly. Frightening, actually. And what does he represent? Okay, well, we know what he represents from a number of elements. One of the elements is hidden because unfortunately where it says you are screen sharing, it covers it up. But at the knot of his tie, there's a swastika. So we know his political orientation. And who is he? All right. Well, he's carrying a typically German Bierstein in one hand, because can't be more German than drinking beer. But in the other hand, he's holding a sword. Right? And what is the connection between the sword and the beer, the swastika? And if you look carefully, there's a scar on the side of his face. And the cap that he's wearing also is representative of something. What does it all represent? Right? In Germany, there were known, universities had fraternities. Here we call it a fraternity, right? In Germany, they're known as eine Burschenschaft. The Burschenschaft was a fraternal organization at universities, but to be a member was not so easy. They were highly selective. Why? They were extremely nationalistic, very right-wing, and anti-Semitic, and racist. And therefore, the odds are if you weren't of the right Aryan ethnicity, you weren't getting in. Once you were in, the whole ideology of the Burschenschaft, again, was this blood and soil and militarism and German superiority and beauty of the German landscape and the marching up and down the mountains and the whole thing. To get into one of these Burschenschaften, one of these fraternities, you had to engage in a duel. It was a symbolic duel. No one got killed. But you had to engage in this duel, and to show that you passed the hazing, I guess the equivalent of hazing, the person who was already in the fraternity, in the Burschenschaft, would take his sword and make a cut on the side of your face, not deep, but enough that it healed over and remained there, scarred for the rest of your life. And that was the symbol that you were, in fact, a member of a Burschenschaft. So this young guy that's what he represents, the youth of Germany, but a very right-wing, politicized, indoctrinated youth. Not a pleasant picture or a hopeful sign for the future. Behind this guy, on the right, is a fellow holding the German imperial flag. If you can see on his, the front of his jacket is a tag, whatever it says, Sozialist. He was a member of the Social Democratic Party. Social Democratic Party was the party mostly of the workers. It's a left-wing party. Was the Communist Party? It was a left-wing party, and represented the bulk of German workers, the labor force, and so on. But apparently, he is not held in particularly high regard, because if you look at the top of his head, where the skull and brain should be, it's emptied out, and there's something else in there instead. To be sort of discreet, it's manure. So what the artist is saying is he's full of manure, right? Basically, the fact is that the Social Democratic Party is a very strong, very powerful party. At one time was basically slowly losing its impact and influence as the extremism in Germany moved forward. Right? To his left is a guy who is probably a journalist. He's the guy who looks like he's got a teacup on his head. Again, very Germanic, the Kaiser Wilhelm mustache and the rimless glasses and so on. And he's carrying a whole bunch of newspapers and something that looks like a quill. So the indication that he's a journalist of the period. So he represents the press. And behind both of them is this big fellow. And he apparently is a political figure who's pontificating to the crowds, and you can see he's not a pleasant looking figure. The look of venom and anger and bitterness on his face obviously represents the extremist rhetoricians of the day, on the extreme right, the fascists, on the extreme left, the communists. And he's filling the room with his rhetoric and his political words and so on, and draped in black, not a figure that is very positive or promising. So he's the personification or the embodiment of extremist rhetoric and political extremism of the day. Behind him, to the right, is a guy holding a sword, and again, a representative of militarism, fascism, the extreme right wing of the party. And then in the corner, on the left corner, it's hard to see. By the way, these are all posted on Blackboard under course materials, and the post is probably bigger, so maybe there's more detail. But in the top left corner, there's a window. and there are flames all over the place, fire, and some of the tongues of flame are licking the window and going through the metal frame. And what does this all represent? Outside, there's a big conflagration, it's a big fire burning, and the fire is heading inside. And what Gross is saying is, this is the fire ahead. This is the middle of the 1920s. It's actually a very positive time in German history after the war, but it's also a watershed year heading in the other direction towards ultimately the success of the Nazis and the end of the Republic. So outside are the flames and the fires of destruction, and they're kind of licking the window, trying to head inside, where all of this agglomeration of all sorts of extremism is sort of condensed in this one Bruegel-like caricature. Peter Bruegel was a famous Flemish, Belgian painter of the Middle Ages who painted these scenes of grotesque-looking people all sort of squashed together within one frame, and that's sort of what this kind of looks like. So you have the sort of the stage for all the different ideological and political and even religious figures of the time, and basically the idiocy and the danger and the extremism, and this is the foreshadowing in many ways of the ultimate collapse of democracy and the rise of fascism. So now this next piece. So this is very interesting, and I told you we'll speak about this movement shortly, and here we are. This is a collage. A collage is a collection of all kinds of things, not necessarily logically placed, but all slapped onto one canvas by a woman by the name of Hannah Höch. And it's these different elements from different, newspapers and magazines, whatever of the time, and different, images of militarism also, and so on. But at various points, you see the word Dada appear. What was Dada? All right, what was that movement about? Okay, somebody tells me about it. It's a fascinating movement. When World War I ended, there was great disillusionment, great disappointment, bitterness, and a feeling that the generation of World War I was lied to. Not just lied to and fed all kinds of misinformation that led to the war. It went deeper. They believed that everything that they were taught and made to believe in and accepted as the truth all the way through, the entire history and heritage of the country, was all a lie, and that everything was untrue, that everything was force-fed, pushed down their throats. They were made to believe it, accept it, not question it. Now all of a sudden thinking, what, we were done a number on. So a movement arose after World War I, in the midst of all of this anger and bitterness, that said, what, we have to reject every single thing that we once held as true and acceptable. We now have to present its opposite, because it was all a lie. And in the world of culture, that led to a movement called the Dada movement. First of all, the name, right? There are different theories about where the name comes from. Dada sounds like the meaningless first syllables of a baby. Probably that's the origin. Someone also suggested that the founders of the movement, a Romanian guy by the name of Tristan Tzara, took a French dictionary and just leafed through it and stopped at a certain point. And on that page is the word Dada, which is the French for a child's hobby horse. More likely it's the first. Why? Because what the Dada movement was all about, it was the anti-art movement. If everything has to now be rejected and tossed out because it was all lies and misinformation, the only thing to replace it has to be the exact opposite. So in art, Dada was anti-art. In other words, Dada artists didn't paint beautiful scenes of landscapes and snow-capped mountains and young innocent girls and flowers. No, they what they considered art was garbage, basically, anti-art. And so one of the interesting examples was a guy named Marcel Duchamp. And these Dada groups, they arose first in Switzerland, and then they found their way. There was Dada movement in Berlin, and then Munich and Paris, and so on. And part of the Dada movement was they would have what were known as happenings. They would announce, okay, we're having a happening this evening at such and such an address, everybody come. What happened at these events? They would engage in all this Dada anti-art stuff. They would have people standing there with a blank canvas on the wall or something, and they would just take every piece of junk and garbage and just paste it on the canvas, and voila, that's art. But one of the great examples, this guy Marcel Duchamp was going to one of these meetings. This is, I don't think the war was even over yet. It was towards the end. Of course, there was tremendous destruction as a result of the war, and buildings were destroyed. There ruins and so on, and they were starting to rebuild. And so, you know what happens when they rebuild or remodel or renovate? They take out all of the old, the fixtures and the kitchen cabinets and the refrigerators and the plumbing and everything, and they toss it out, put it on the corner or on the side of the road for the garbage truck to take it away. So he's walking through this Dada happening, and all of a sudden he notices in one of these buildings, they've taken out the plumbing, and there's a urinal sitting there on the side of the road waiting to be carted off. Kind of looks at it and said, aha, this is Dada art. He picks up the urinal, goes to the meeting that's happening, sets the urinal down on a block of wood, and said, there it is, that's art. Because that's ultimate Dada art, right? Because you can't more anti-art than a urinal, right? And it's now, was it Duchamp or Arp? It was one of the two, it was Arp. Anyway, it doesn't matter. And it's in a museum somewhere now. It's like considered one of the great pieces of Dada art. So Dada was the movement that rejected everything culturally, and art became anti-art. That wasn't only true in art, it was true in literature. So, for example, in one of these Dada gatherings, a guy who was a Dada poet, for example, would get up, and for hours on end, he would just keep repeating meaningless symbols and sounds, absolutely like a baby. But he would do this for hours. Not one real word, just syllables, and one after another. So that was Dada. And that was one of the very important and very striking artistic reactions to the end of the war and to everything that the war stood for. And this is an example of a Dada collage of apparently meaningless images just plastered willy-nilly or whatever without any logic or reason behind them on this canvas. Right. This is a piece by a very tragic figure, really, the name of Käthe Kollwitz. Käthe Kollwitz, let me tell you something about her first. Unfortunately, her experiences in the war had a very tragic personal aspect to them, because she lost two sons on the Western Front. They were killed, and clearly that influenced her artistic output. But it wasn't just that. Her background, was something about her, also sort of pointed in a certain direction early on. Basically, from the family background. Anyway, Käthe Kollwitz was born in 1867. She died in 1945. So she was a German artist, worked with drawing and etching and lithographs and woodcuts. You can see this is the lithograph. And did also some sculpture. her most famous art cycles included The Weavers and the Peasant War. These were a series of art that represented, the impoverished and the exploited and so on. She always had a very left-wing orientation, not surprisingly, because her father, by the way, was one who arranged her early drawing lessons, realizing she had talent. But her father was very much involved in various left-wing political organizations, so there was already a clear political coloration to her artwork. Also, she married a doctor who was a medical doctor, but he served only in the poorer neighborhoods of Berlin. He dedicated his practice to the serving the impoverished and so on. So I mean, all in all, her sort of orientation was of a left-wing, clearly left-wing coloration, and that's clearly shown in her art, but also enhanced by the experience of World War I, because, like I said, she lost her sons on the Western Front, and she already before that had suffered from depression, and this, of course, exacerbated that problem. You can see in this particular image of a woman, it's one of the post-World War I etchings that she did, and the sadness and the sense of loss and the basically the resignation is clear from the not only the face of this individual but also the way the hands are placed, and it's hard to tell sometimes where the hair ends and where the whatever she's wearing begins, because it's just all draped in black, all sign of mourning, obviously connected to Kollwitz's own experiences, the loss of her sons, and this is quintessential mother of war, the one who's lost a husband or a child or whatever, and the unbearable pain but unending mourning, mourning, that will accompany these people for the rest of their lives, because these are irreplaceable loss. And you can see in the expression of this woman, first of all, the closed eyes, as though, I mean, she almost appears, dead herself, but there's no light in her eyes, there's no life. And the expression of not just sadness and mourning, but resignation. There's no hope. And the hands, the way the hands are placed, again, a sense of, having given up and basically having little hope for expectations or anything better in the future. They almost appear as the hands of someone who's passed away, like a corpse. They're lifeless. And there are many, many of these etchings and lithographs that she did, basically on the same theme or variations on the same theme, that exhibit and represent the incredible and brutal loss, and the fact that there's really no going forward, and there's no filling the hole or the gap that's left. It's all basically hopelessness and unending mourning, and basically resignation. All right, this next picture is Max Beckmann. Beckmann was also one of these figures like Dix and Gross and so on from that period and that background and that art school of art of Neue Sachlichkeit, new objectivity, and so on. Max Beckmann was born in February of 1884. He died in December of 1950. He was a painter, a draftsman, a printmaker, a sculptor. He also was a writer. And again, very much in the expressionist tradition. He was born into a middle-class family in Leipzig, in Saxony. Even as a youth, he started his art career, and he pitted himself against the old masters. He was sort of an innovator and a rebel, and didn't go along with traditional art already in the beginning. So needless to say, after the war, he was very much at home in developing his own unique style that was anything but traditional. During the period of the Weimar Republic, the 1920s, he actually enjoyed a lot of success, and he was very much honored officially. In fact, he was chosen in 1925 to teach a master class in art in Frankfurt am Main. And he had some very famous students, actually. But when Hitler came to power, his fortunes changed, needless to say, and his art was already considered degenerate. And he was himself, they called him a cultural Bolshevik. I mean, his politics are very left-wing, but he was a cultural Bolshevik also for the Nazis, meaning that his art and his culture were also, communist and anti-German and unacceptable and so on. And so obviously his works were confiscated by the Nazi government and became part of that exhibit of degenerate art and so on. So for a while, he lived in exile, in self-imposed exile in Amsterdam. And he tried desperately to get to the United States, but each attempt failed. And then in 1944, the Germans tried to get him back. They occupied Holland, right? And tried to get him into the army, the German army, basically as a punishment. He was already 60-something years, 60 years old, and had already had a heart attack. So they were doing this as punishment, because they knew he wasn't going to make it. He actually had done a bit of artwork that was quite significant while he was living in Amsterdam in exile as well. Finally, he, except for the rest of his life, he suffered various cardiac issues. He did survive the war, and then he came to America, and for a while he was connected to the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and then he went to St. Louis, was connected with the St. Louis University Museum of Art, and so on. And he finished his life in the United States, and basically, if I recall what happened, I think it was actually Christmas Day. He the way he died was he was actually crossing Central Park West, and he was hit. Either he had a heart attack or he was hit by a car or something. But it was on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and that's when he passed away. This painting that you have in front of you is also sort of a Bruegel-like, collection of grotesque-looking figures. It's called Das Frauenbad. It's basically, literally, I mean, it's the women's bathhouse. But it was painted in 1919, right after the war ended. Right, the war ended in 1918. And the reason he came up with this image was it represents the civilian suffering and the horrors that he experienced on the Western Front. He was, again, a soldier in World War I. And he was so moved by it that he had to express his horror and his frustration in this painting. And he said about it, I'll translate it from the German, he said, "My religion is, it's not I'm against God. It's rather that I want to know how God could have created human beings that act the way they do. How could human beings so lacking in sympathy and empathy and basic decency and humanity that they commit acts that they do and against other human beings?" And obviously during World War I, we know the atrocities committed in Belgium by the German army. And so he realized that there was just some basic flaw in human nature. And he just couldn't reconcile that with supposedly a benevolent God that, who created mankind. Why did you create this? Basically his question. So here we have this conglomeration or compressed vision of these women and children. What's it all about? All right, it's the middle of the war, and their husbands or maybe their sons are off fighting, right? And they feel a greater sense of security if they're all together. It's frightening. You have foreign invaders, and we know the acts committed by the German army were less than honorable. So at least together, they felt a sense of security, instead of being alone and defenseless. So what do we see here? Well, first of all, looking from the front, the most immediate figure is this woman with her back to the viewer. obviously starving, right? Because you see all of her bones sticking out. So she's a victim of starvation, malnutrition, and so on. And again, unfortunately, her face is covered up by that strip. You can, when you can look at these again on Blackboard, but it's the face of a woman who's frightened and there's a feeling of hopelessness, whatever. To her left is another woman looking off. Everyone is sort of looking in their own direction, basically. And this woman is sitting there with a young infant at her side, presumably her child. But apparently the child is not connected. Like she's in a world of her own and obviously preoccupied with her own issues of survival and whatever, and probably can't do much for the child. It's probably starving also. And so it's not the typical scene of a mother nurturing or holding or grasping her child, but rather of a frustrated and a mother who is powerless to do anything and a child who is a victim. On the other side of the woman in the front is another female figure with a not particularly appealing look on her face, obviously someone who's suffering greatly as well. And behind her is a woman, clearly emaciated, holding a child who himself appears to be emaciated and perhaps even lacking clothing, and crying, obviously, and frightened and hungry, and a mother who can basically do nothing about it. She's helpless. Then in the middle of all of this is a very bizarre looking figure, a woman who seems to be on sort of a swing or other, but she has a very interesting look on her face. Unlike all the others, she is smiling. But I think she's not smiling out of happiness or a sense of fulfillment. She's lost her mind, right? It's the smile of someone who is demented, someone who is insane, someone who is, living in their own world. And so she's swinging above the rest of everyone else with this bizarre smile on her face, obviously having lost it in light of what's going on. And then again, on her left are these female figures who are contorted and desperate looking and helpless. One in the corner there was also looks like she might have lost her mind, on the left, extreme left, with the hands crossed and so on. But all of these figures are helpless, frightened, and abandoned females. By the way, the one that's holding the child, there's another little child peeking up from her side, also with a look of horror and the look of pain and suffering in her face, obviously hungry and frightened. So all of them are sort of put together, cast in this one grotesque image of these victims, these female victims of the war. And what's interesting is in the very back, I guess these are two lights, but the two lights appear as though they're two eyes with a halo around it. They remind one of the famous picture by the Norwegian Edvard Munch, also, by the way, a World War I artist, of the scream, the existential scream, the face on the guy who's screaming, sort of reminds one or suggests that image behind all of these figures. So again, it's a representation of the alienation, hopelessness, suffering of these victims, the women and their children, who are being left to fend for themselves and who are obviously not doing too well, and for whom there is no sense of compassion or sense of charity or humanity at all. All right, this is another George Grosz painting, an interesting one. It's called Grauer Tag, or Gray Day. And what it shows are three different strata of society post-World War I. First is the guy in the front. The guy in the front looks like a pretty successful businessman, carries out their showcase and whatever the thing is to, I guess, an architect that help them draw straight lines, but seems well-heeled, doing well, nicely dressed, and a very substantial bourgeois figure. One of the things you'll note, by the way, none of these characters are looking at each other. Everyone is looking their own way. So there's no connection, there's no bonding, there's no sense of cohesiveness or one caring for the other. Each one's looking in their own direction and obviously concerned with their own lives. So that's the first guy. Behind him is a war veteran. The war veteran obviously is missing one arm, but in the other arm, he has his hand holding a stick, obviously to help him walk. Doesn't have a particular look of contentment or happiness on his face, hunched over and lost, basically. There's no war anymore. That was his reason for being, his cause célèbre, or raison d'être, and now he's a returned veteran and no one cares about him. And he has to suffer his fate, and his fate is to have been maimed and turned into a handicapped individual as a result of the war. And he's walking his way. To his left is a guy going off to work, a spade on his shoulder and so on. He's a worker. Interesting thing about this guy, the worker, he hasn't got any facial features. Why? Because he's another one of these faceless, individuals who lacks any sense of individuality or any sense of being special. He's just part of the mass of workers. They don't count for anything. They're all the same. One looks like the other. They have the same life, the same expectations. And so he's faceless, part of the faceless crowd. And he's walking off in his direction. Obviously, no one cares about him. He's just off to do his work, the same every day. And basically, he's a cog in a wheel and has no special significance and no sense of being a person unto himself, just another faceless worker. And then on the other side, leering behind that wall, is a guy in a uniform, in a robe. It's a judge. He's a judge. He represents jurisprudence, judiciary. But he's a peculiar and suspicious-looking guy. And he's sort of hiding off on the side. And what is the suggestion? That there's no sense of justice. The justice is, if it exists at all, is unconcerned with actually seeing that people enjoy their rights, or that they have the ability to appeal injustices or whatever. He is just sort of hidden on the side, and justice, basically what he's saying is justice doesn't exist anymore. There's no sense of fairness. There's no sense of adjudication of complaints. There's basically no fairness at all. Everything is sort of wanton and without any structure to provide people with their basic rights and to address their basic issues and complaints. So justice is hidden and it's suspicious looking. And behind the whole thing is the ubiquitous factory, belching all of that smoke, making it a gray day. But again, it's cold, brick, or whatever, cement, very uninviting. It's a place where you have to go to work. You are a faceless worker like this guy. And at the end of the day, you go home, only come back the next day to do the same thing ad nauseum, day in and day out. So it's not just a gray day, that particular day, it's a gray day. It's a description of the whole period in time after World War I. Everything is sort of gray. There's no promise for the future. There's no sense of hope or optimism. Everyone goes about their business alone, disconnected, no sense of community, and clear stratification of society. Either you're the guy on the front who has a job and a nice income and a decent lifestyle, or you're the returned veteran who everyone's forgotten about after he made the great sacrifice, or you're the faceless worker who has the same monotonous task day in and day out. And presiding over all of this is a judge who really doesn't care, stuck on the side. Okay, so these are very few of the myriad pieces of art that came out of World War I, or that related or reflect World War I. But there's only so much time, and these are just a few examples. One last thing we didn't talk about, and but I think it's interesting, specifically for a Lehman College student. When World War I ended, there's mass destruction. And all of a sudden, you have to go back to life. Where are you going to live? Housing, everything bombed out. So someone had to come up with an idea to provide efficient and cost-effective housing. So a movement arose, an architectural movement. It was originally architectural, called the Bauhaus, B-A-U-H-A-U-S. Bauhaus, literally in German, is the house of building. And so it began as an architectural movement. What was it all about? It was about finding a way of mass producing proper and appropriate housing. So how did they do that? They had this idea. We're going to build things based on simple but functional and easily produced material. For example, we're going to take concrete squares or concrete rectangles. Right? Very easy. This concrete is easily produced. You pour it into a mold, and there you've got it. And this is going to be the basis for housing. Either it'll be simple. You take one of these concrete blocks, let's say, it's empty in the middle. So what does it need? Well, it needs some windows and a door. So you mass produce doors. The factory just turns out doors. Windows, same thing, metal windows. You produce the window frames and the glass and put it in. But you want it to look a little bit more, aesthetic, a little more artistic, a little more pleasing. So you can do the same thing, but also add an artistic flair to it. So what do? For example, you take a first floor of a long rectangular block, and the second floor is, let's say, a square block that covers part of the rectangle. So it's two-story. And you put in the windows, and the windows aren't going to be like the typical windows you see, but rather, because sunlight is a rare commodity in that part of Europe, you make these long windows so they get as much light as possible. And they go from the top to the bottom. And to get from the first floor to the second, you don't want to waste space, because what space is at a premium, so you mass produce spiral staircases. They're also very pleasant to look at, and they save a lot of room, as opposed to a stairwell, which takes up a lot of space. And you can mass produce those. They're metal, the factory produces them in huge numbers, and the steps themselves are made of standard size wood. So another factory produces the wood, and you put it all together, and you've got this really interesting looking house. And then they did that with office buildings, same idea. And so Bauhaus architecture became very popular and the standard in terms of modern construction. This is mass-produced, and the parts are mass-produced very easily and efficiently, and doesn't cost much when you produce it that way, using machines. On the Lehman College campus is a piece of Bauhaus architecture designed by one of the main figures in the Bauhaus, Governor Marcel Breuer. It's Schuster Hall. And if you look at Schuster Hall, take the facade away for a second, what is it? It's just two concrete squares, right? And to make it look more appealing, there's this catacomb or honeycomb-like thing in the front, but that's also mass-produced in a factory that does, this kind of brickwork. And by putting that in the front of the plain concrete, it looks, looks nicer. It gives it more of an artistic appeal or whatever. And that's one example right there on the Lehman campus, which is landmarked and can never be torn down, even though I think it's a particularly ugly building. But nevertheless, perfect example of Bauhaus architecture. But that wasn't all. The Bauhaus said, well, architecture is part of it. What about design, decoration inside? We can do the same thing. We can use machine, mass-produced products, but we can do it in a way that makes them both pleasant to look at, but also efficient and cost-effective, and give them a certain artistic aspects so they're not too boring by using machines again. The machines can take metal objects, we can mass produce knives and forks and spoons, whatever, and using a certain machinery, we can engrave mass numbers of engraving on the end of the spoon or whatever to give it more of an artistic flavor. And again, it can be done in huge numbers because it all comes out of a factory. And this led to other things, Bauhaus furniture, which, by the way, is the model for IKEA and these other mass-produced, relatively inexpensive outlets, because the parts are mass-produced and then just putting together. And it's a piece of modern furniture, which is functional and somewhat, I guess, if that's your taste, somewhat appealing, and also not clumsy and overbearing, right? The very simple parts that, again, give a feeling of space and places where there isn't a lot of space. So the Bauhaus was also another artistic offshoot of World War I. If there were more time, it's a fascinating subject with all sorts of interesting figures in the world of art that contributed. It was a whole school of architecture, and they had various departments. Some dealt only with color theory, how to use colors effectively. Others weaving, how to make rugs or wall hangings using machinery, but also very pleasant to look at. There were even printing workshops, how to create print types that could be used in mass printing and provide very interesting style of lettering and so on. A very interesting movement that came out of World War I as well, but that's a whole topic unto itself. So basically, this is the brief introduction to World War I art. And you can see in the art the different issues and after effects of the war. And these are some of the representative figures who are best known and most representative of that period. And with that, semester ends. Went by very quickly. Sorry, the circumstances in which we had to do this, never see each other in person. But this hopefully will pass as well. And hopefully it'll just be a sad memory at some point very soon and life will go back to normal. Anyway, thank you for attending the class and good luck, and enjoy the holidays.